Hello and welcome to the In the Beginning podcast, where we bring story lovers wonderful tales written by independently published authors. It is our mission to help indie authors grow through dialogue created by the reviews you leave, as well as bi-weekly topic segments. This week we bring you Summer of the Long Knives by LS Bassen. After a brutal attack, one woman receives the ability to foresee the future, and becomes a key player in the assassination of Adolf Hitler. After the show, remember to leave a comment about what you just heard at acmbooks.com/indie-beginning or in the comments section of the podcast page you found us on. Tune in next week when we discuss writing alternative history with the author. One note before we begin. This episode deals with adult content, including sexual violence and language. If you are uncomfortable with either of these topics, please pass up on this episode. We have many others to choose from. And now, allow Indie Beginning to introduce you to Summer of the Long Knives. Very little from a personal perspective has been written about the assassination of German Chancellor Adolf Hitler on July 1st, 1934, following the so-called Night of the Long Knives. This night had been designated by Hitler's supporters for the arrest and elimination of Ernest Röhm and other key members of his brown-shirt stormtroopers. Because of their tactics, and particularly because the German army could brook no challenge to its supremacy, Röhm and his stormtrooper officers had become a political liability to the man they had helped up the ladder of power. By 4 p.m. on Sunday, July 1st, they were all dead. But so was Chancellor Hitler, in his Chancellery Gardens. The death of these, and of certain others to follow, brought an abrupt end to what some scholars believe could have been the most savage and inhuman era in recorded history. The year before, in 1933, the governments of Prussia, Baden, and Bavaria rescinded all laws of the Republic against the dueling known as Bestimmungsmesser. The popular newspaper Völkischer Beobachter said, "These measures will restore the sound, healthy idea that a man should take a weapon in his hand to avenge an insult, instead of going before a judge and having his honor measured by legal paragraphs, as under the Republic." Some, like priest and moral philosopher Conrad felt these grudge duels were less an exercise in honor than a resurrected ritual of pain that characterizes male puberty rites in primitive hunting societies worldwide. The subliminal purpose of this elaborate test of the male ability to endure pain, they argued, was separation from maternal identification and dominance. The role of a dubious paternity was thereby legitimized by a traumatic, second bloody birth to which adolescent males would consciously refer throughout their adult life. Contestants in the Bestimmungsmesser were teenagers with shaved heads. They wore narrow wire goggles to protect their eyes, a thick padded collar protected their jugular vein, and a padded sleeve protected their right arm from wrist to shoulder. A doctor, perhaps a symbol of masculine authority, supervised the ritual, standing at a table with disinfectant and bandages, needles and tourniquets. The doctor wiped the broad razor-like blades of the basket-hilted rapiers to sterilize them for continued use. No real fencing went on. Opponents must not flinch or change positions. The stroke was a quick snap of the wrist. From time to time, the seconds raised their rapiers and called, "Halt!" The doctor stepped in to stanch blood and stethoscope the boys' hearts. Finally came the sewing up of gaping cuts and the flashlight photographs to send to proud parents at home. On Chancellor Hitler's birthday in April of 1933, students of Heidelberg, celebrating in the first such duel in 547 years, sent a telegram with pledges of allegiance to their Führer. The children of Hamelin sent a box of pretzel mice for Adolf Hitler's 44th birthday. Their card said, "You are our Pied Piper now." The young of Germany, especially the university students, were the Chancellor's most ardent followers, and were far more anti-Semitic than either the working class or the bourgeois. More than 10% of Germany was unemployed. The fragile Weimar Republic was tilting dangerously toward a communist solution. This fertile economic field was planted with seeds like Spengler's 1918 bestseller, The Decline of the West, in which a conflict between civilization and culture could only be resolved under a national ethnic, cultural socialist dictator. Mussolini was doing very well along these lines to the south. 1 year later, on a mid-May afternoon in 1934, the artist model Lisel Ganz, so central a figure in the little-understood chain of events leading to Hitler's assassination, was coming to the corner of Gitzerstrasse and Lindenstrasse. The warm morning sun she felt on her back put its wide hand now on her cheek. With a full stomach, she felt even the sun loved her. Her breakfast had been bought for her this morning by Horst Dorner, a corporal in the Liebstandart, Hitler's 100 personal guards. She knew the eager soldier from their hometown of Baldstad, a small village 200 kilometers southwest of Berlin. Lisel did not especially like Corporal Dorner. He was no taller than she, his nails were badly bitten down, and too much of the whites of his eyes showed when he lowered his voice to speak of things he considered terribly important. But if Lisel took exception to all men she did not especially like, she would not eat nearly so well. Like her mother, she was at this point of her life a pragmatist. The Morgenpost she saw a passing Berliner reading had the date printed too small to be seen quickly. She wondered if Horst had been right, that it was already the 12th of May. At 19, nearly 20, Lisel did not keep track of the calendar that much. But she had a modeling appointment for the 14th, and she needed the money for a canary yellow dress she had seen. "Me in numbers," she had said, tapping her forehead as she sat facing Horst in the cafe where they had eaten. She had tilted her head so loosened strands from her pinned-up white blonde braids swept the tabletop. She had tapped her high and perfect forehead again, and closed her eyes for a moment of punctuation. It was really to wet her eyes so that when she opened them again, Horst would see them dewy. Liezel's shrug completed her helpless gesture. She could be an actress if she really wanted to be, not just an artist model. What was nicest about the play acting was that it seemed to satisfy these men in Berlin. Horst worshipped her beauty. She was ideal. Part of being ideal meant not being cornered into their beds, which was wonderful. And they bought her meals. The men Lisel knew in Berlin were mostly a boring lot. Horst had been especially boring this morning. He reminisced again about how he got scars on his cheeks. They were still a purpley pink, but Horst assured Lisel that they would whiten over time. He went on and on about the differences between scar tissue and normal skin. This over breakfast. Lisel could gag at the thought now that she was full. Horst and his eye whites and whitening scars. He had leaned over the coffee mug and put his hand beside her own, not touching it. He had whispered, "And now you know how they sat together in a circle outside his door, all the officers, concentrating in silence together." She took another bite of apple from the strudel, saving the sugared crust for last. "Whose door?" He had shaken his head lightly. Never mind whose door. It was the circle of officers all concentrating at the issue. She sipped her black coffee. Why? What were they doing? He pressed his lips together. He had little patience. They were concentrating on the man inside the office who was being interrogated, questioned, he explained. She tilted her head again and blinked her beautiful eyes. "I don't see the point of it all. It sounds silly." Horst moved his hands back to his lap. The purpose was to assist in the questioning process through the powers of concentration to be found in pure minds. Really? She could see by his eyes that it was. She sighed. "Forgive me. These things are all beyond me, you know. My mother had my horoscope cast one time, but would never tell me what it said. And I was taken to an evening with Ursula Kardorsch by an artist I modeled for. But I didn't follow a thing there either. I didn't see why anyone would want to know what will happen beforehand. And as for knowing something especially bad, why suffer as much before as you must anyway after?" "You are a philosopher after all," he said. "You tease me. I adore you," he said, folding over his napkin. This was a signal that breakfast was over. She found these signals of his so boring. "As for predictions," he said in concluding voice, "the Führer has genuine powers of prophecy. There will be a war when the state orders have been filled by industry. He has eliminated unemployment for now, but in 8 years' time, he foresees there will be another economic recession. There will be only one remedy for this, the creation of more living space for our surplus population. The Western powers will never yield this vital space to us. That is why a series of decisive blows will be necessary, first in the West and then in the East." Lisel was standing by her chair, waiting for Horst to offer her his arm, to escort her out of the cafe door. "I was born during the war," she said. "I in the year of its beginning." He opened the cafe door for her. Close to her, he leaned his face toward her neck and inhaled. "What a beauty you are," he whispered. She saw a tremble move through his scars. "What a beautiful womanliness indeed. Again he hovered close to her, and made more buzzing noises in her ear. Then characteristically he withdrew with a soldierly forbearance. A quick caress and a whispered Heil Hitler marked the end of their date. Outside, as he strode away, he turned a last time to flash a gallant smile. Then he vanished around a corner. Once the hideousness of his scars had faded from her mind's eye, Lisel entertained herself with the compliments that had been showered upon her. The sun on her arms as she walked past the old stone synagogue on Lindenstrasse felt like a stroking of a cat's fur. She was the cat. Women and children came out of the temple into the brightness of Saturday morning, followed by men. She saw them around her as colors and shapes, and the alien Hebrew sounds of a song sung by a group of children who had joined their hands above their heads were little more than a cheerful backdrop to a sunny day. As she moved around them, she smiled. Marching in the street towards her, however, a dozen brown uniformed men viewed her as a member of the Jewish congregation leaving the Sabbath service. Their error was understandable. Like the others, she was nicely dressed, in a white suit that the older admirer had given her, and her full stomach and hoarse-whispered adoration had given her face a satisfied look very similar to the religious pleasure that marked the faces of those who had departed the service. She could see by the brown of their uniforms that these approaching men were not members of Horst's elite corps. She felt her superiority wrap around her tightly like a summer shawl. It made her shift her shoulders just a bit farther back and raise her chin, as if one of the artists she modeled for had ordered a new pose. She was in no way frightened of the heavy-booted men. But the Jews were behind her. She could feel this fear before she stopped to look at them. The mothers and fathers were calling to their children, grabbing them by hands and scattering as fast as they could. She looked back towards the approaching soldiers, then again at the running Jews, and something fluttered in her chest, like the flight of a pigeon at the noise. The soldiers shouted. Suddenly then, she was afraid, and instinctively she ran. She had long legs, she was young, and she was frightened, but disbelief at the center of things slowed her down. It was quickly then, in an empty alley, that three of them caught her. They did not even have to knock her down. Once they had caught her, as if at tag, she stood still and waited for the game to stop. Others tackled people down the block, while she looked over her three attackers, and they her, with hard-breathing faces reddened in the May sun from the excitement and the race. She also heard the various cries of a few small children as if they had fallen from skinned knees, of mothers pleading in shrilled voices, and the immediate groans of men. These sounds penetrated through the stiff, soft, leaf-scented perfume of the air, through the familiar surrounding vision of the sidewalk, trees, and buildings that had met Lindenstrasse only moments before. The sounds frightened her so much that her mouth was dry and she was panting. She lifted her hand to her brow. "It's wet," she said to the three men. They were ignoring her. It was so peculiar. She kept talking to these. One was much older, a middle-aged man. The other two were young, about her own age. They were busy amongst themselves and around her, holding her arms down tightly. They had not liked her raising her arm to her forehead. They barked orders at her, and she obeyed. She did not know all the rules of this Berlin game. The older one, who was holding her from behind, his arms pinned across her chest, had a smell of onions about him. He kept lifting his knee and jabbing her buttocks. The rough material of his pants chafed the back of her legs. The two younger ones slapped her at first, increasing in the force of the blows as a kind of match with one another. One was reddish-haired and freckled, and the other was dark. He was growing a mustache over his lips. He was biting his lips, but his mustache was very thin. "Dirty whore," the onion man screamed in her ear. "She thinks she's better than us," the red hair yelled. "Look at her." "Stop this," she ordered, surprising herself. "She thinks her looks fooled us. Let me go this instant." She turned, cracking her elbow across the onion man's face. His grip momentarily loosened, then redoubled around her like a band of iron. His breathing was wild. "Give it to her now," he bellowed. "Now!" "Let go!" she screamed, when a terrible blow to her stomach caved her forward. Not a rock. It was the red hair's fist. "Over there!" shouted the onion man to the mustache, who bent to his left and picked up a short, flat board. She screamed as the board rose above her head. Onion Man still held her. Then the ground came up, a bigger, flatter, harder board. It was momentarily cushioned by the fat onion, who rolled out from under her and threw his body down on hers. The other two stood away. Their urging cries were a kind of applause. Her vision was red. "Jewish cunt!" "I'm not a Jew," she screamed. "Please!" His breath was in her ear. "A Michelin cunt, then. I'll only be screwing the Jewish half." She felt his first push between his stomach and hers, pushing down his pants, tearing down her white skirt, ripping down her panties. The elastic of her garter snapped against his hand, and he punched her for it. She grunted against his heaving chest and tasted the breakfast rise up in her throat. She vomited altogether when he stuck it into her. The other two laughed and laughed, but urged their fellow on for their own turns. The pain was different from the fist in the board. The world was red. It smelt of blood. It was a crucifixion. The air cooled for an instant. Then another was on her. With no fumbling, he was ready, and he moved differently from the first, as if he were all of one piece. A horseman riding her. He was very quick, and his explosion seemed to blow him back from her. Her tightly closed eyes opened a slit to see him, the red hair. There was a surprise on his face. He patted Mustache's shoulders, then shoved him toward her. "It's easy," he muttered. "Bigger and looser." "Shut up, your whole onion," said. "Hurry up, the others are getting away." A third time her head was banged against the sidewalk, and this one used his knee to separate her thighs. "Blood! She's bleeding," he called out. "Never mind, it wasn't there first," one said. She could no longer and cared no longer to recognize each face. "Hurry up!" This one stuck into the wet soreness and bounced above her, propping himself off her stomach and chest with his hands pressed to the cement, as if he did not want to touch her more than he had to. She was crying and blubbering horse name and rank to the cores, but the performance above her continued, a constant rocking, each rocking a new pain. "Oh, for Christ's sakes, finish it," one of them yelled. The voice above her held yet back. "I can't." "Put your garbage by the back door, fucker." Another voice. She could feel his relief as he quickly pulled out, slid his hands around her waist and turned her over. "Now it looks like home," one laughed from further away. She tasted the vomit in her mouth again. This pain stank as much as it split her in two. Her muscles heaved against the thrust. All her bowels roared back. There was a new scream from above and behind, quickly followed by a firm, approving slap. Amazing. She felt the sun on her skin there. Okay, she heard them dancing around her. She was lying on the sidewalk, her legs drawn up against her body, painfully. But still they tucked in against the bleeding and the cramping muscles. The board struck her head again and again. She turned this way and that. Each ear lost its hearing, and she was falling down. Down and down into the cold and dark. 3.5 hours later, a broad-backed man cracked the brass knocker on a wooden door on Prinzengrastrasse. The door was highly polished, extravagantly carved, and imposing. He pressed the bell and stamped on the stone step impatiently, changing the gesture as if here cleaning the bottom of his shoes so that passers-by would not become suspicious. The man was out of place in this upper-class Wilmersdorf neighborhood. Upstairs a bell rang after the sound of the knocking ceased. Albert Entrater, studiously wiping a paintbrush against a soft cloth, looked around at his two friends. He was of middle height and of 40 years old. His looks were dark and even without being handsome. His right arm stopped at the white cuff of his shirt, extending from a dark jacket. He had no right hand. "I don't know who it is," Albert said to his friends. "I didn't even invite either of you." His teasing, as usual, was met with the offhand smiles of people long accustomed to and able to see through each other's mannerisms. He smoothed the brush and laid it down beside its clean mates. He stood before a huge covered easel. "You can never find a policeman or a housekeeper when you want one," he said. It was housekeeper Lot's day off. "I don't go looking for the police," Conrad said. He stood, "But I'll get the door." He sprinted out of the room and down the stairs to the main floor of the apartment. Ludwig Brezina commented on his exit. "He must be the Pegasus of Berlin's priest." Ludwig smiled and neatly inhaled his cigarette. He was small and blond and fair, precise in all movements. Ludwig was a journalist originally from Prague. Conrad preached as he thinks in flying leaps. Albert, I wish I could see you actually at work. Are you mostly a mythological artist? Double entendre, thoroughly intended? All I am certain of is that you are a most accomplished cleaner of brushes. Albert waved him aside and moved to a chair facing the couch where Ludwig was sitting. The soft cushions of a matching chair on the other side of a large marble-mantled fireplace still kept Conrad's outline. The fireplace was dark, covered by an ornate brass fan screen. Don't bite the one hand that feeds you, Albert laughed. There were double footsteps on the stairs. Conrad entered first. The man he brought with him was a startling contrast. He was beefy and bowed a bit at the shoulders. It seemed the habit from carrying a weight on his back. But it was as much a matter of manner as a muscle. He smelled of strong beer, tobacco, and sweat. He looked around at the three faces. When he spoke, his speech had the accent of Berlin's lowest working class. Comrade, he addressed Albert. I am of all people not your comrade, sir. Conrad and Ludwig laughed. The worker nodded with his own kind of understanding, then reached into his pants pocket and drew out a name card. Albert's. He handed it to him. Albert looked it over, front and back, saw a date he had penciled on it, and nodded. And so? We broke up a little brown shirt party over in Lindenstrasse a while ago. They were giving a pretty blonde a nice going over. This is all we found on her. We carted her off to the hospital in a bad way. I didn't know how's you'd like the police connecting your name to hers. So I pocketed it. Albert returned to his chair and sat down without offering the man a seat. He fiddled with the card. She is my model. I expected her for this Monday. He passed the card around to verify the date. She has posed for me twice. He looked up at the man, then seemed to see the swollen bruises on his face for the first time. He looked at the man's hands, which were also cut and bruised. All Nazis are bastards, Ludwig said softly. What is her condition? Conrad asked the man. Unconscious when we carried her in. We caught the scum that got her, and some of the others. Some of the others who got some of the other Jews. They were coming out of the synagogue. Conrad covered his eyes with one hand, then wiped the rest of his face down. She's not Jewish, Albert said. She's one of yours, in fact, Con. Will she recover? Asked Ludwig. The man shrugged. She was a beauty, huh? They're real brave with the women and children, these shit shirts. But the crew will be pissing blood for a while. Bormann will have to dig deep in the Hilskasa kitty to patch those pigs. Don't worry, Ludwig repeated with irony. There's a rumor that they'll take a holiday from all of this, all of Rome's roughnecks. No more communist catching or Jew baiting for the month of July, to let the lung chancellor climb a few more rungs of his ladder. But I don't believe they can resist their fun. He started humming a popular wheel song. Can't help ourselves or you or anyone. May the wood be old and the rungs rot under handsome Adolf's cloven feet, Conrad said. He put one finger under his nose to gesture Hitler's mustache. Ah, I think Goebbels could justifiably call that carping, Ludwig sneered theatrically. He referred to the Minister of Propaganda's attack the day before in the newspapers against those who found the fault with the National Socialist means and ends. I'll be going then, the visitor said to Albert, who nodded and walked him back down the stairs. Ludwig had stood and made as if to escort the man out, but Albert had held up his hand to stop him. While Albert was out of the room, Ludwig wondered what a stormtrooper holiday would be like. Hours of marching band music, boyish pranks like live burials, sword sharpening and bloodletting. You artists are limited by the civilized imagination. Rome and his stormtrooper boys bathe nude in the blood fountain of the cultural unconscious, if they bathe at all. Albert returned to the studio as Ludwig's rant flourished and died. He was putting his wallet back into his pocket and shaking his head. It was unclear whether he meant disapproval of Ludwig's comment or some commentary on his dealings with the departed visitor. As a man of means, he felt only slightly more comfortable with the communists than with the Nazis. Well, what is it to be, Albert? Conrad asked. What is what to be? We have A, now we must have B, Conrad said, mimicking Albert's familiar logical dictum. What do you do about the girl? That I don't know, Albert said, facing the priest. Conrad went to a table where plates of bread, meat, and fruit were arranged. He bit into an apple, sniffing its scent as he chewed. That means he already had some arrangement. Haven't you, Albert? At least money still talks. Albert smiled. The back of his chair was to Conrad. How you love to glamorize, Con. If I were an artist like you, Ludwig said by the window, I would not paint on canvas. I would not. I would take a broad brush and refashion the whole damn world. Canvas costs enough, Albert said. But I am going to Romanish's, Ludwig announced, despite my disdain for cafe crowds and revolving doors. He referred to the popular cafe and night spot on Berlin's vulgarly, glitterly main thoroughfare. You can't get good conversation there either, Albert said. Too true, said Ludwig. Tillich left Frankfurt last year, said Conrad, and the disease has spread to Berlin. Hindemith, too, Ludwig added. Hindemith, Albert said. Last week. They had moved to the wide landing up the stairs. Ludwig put on his hat. I had to give those stormtroop bastards money the last time I went to Frankfurt, Ludwig complained. I guess they don't shake you down, he said to the priest. Not yet, Conrad said. Oh, but everywhere talk is so bloody tame with everyone saying oblique goodbyes through the hat-raising and handshaking. You could hear a good argument any place. The communists and the Nazis have taken all the good verbal violence and translated it gutturally. Take care, said Albert to his friends. He squeezed several bills into Ludwig's hands. The young journalist made only a token resistance. Ludwig and Conrad went downstairs, and Albert returned to his studio to look out the window. He gazed out at the street below and saw his friends moving away in their separate directions. He turned from the window, walked to the large canvas, and lifted the sheet. He examined the strong-colored strokes he had added before his friend's arrival. He took some steps back, then closer again. In a characteristic gesture, he put his thumb to his mouth and bit its fullness in concentration. He strained against what he saw in the painting of myth and heard the echo of Ludwig's teasing quip. The green and gold glowed. The crimson was precisely right. But he lowered the sheet in annoyance and filled his cheeks with an exhaled sigh. He thought of Ludwig's ambition to refashion the existing world. Hard enough to see it, he thought. He puffed out, ran his hand down his slacks, and suddenly made for the stairs himself. After 5 days in the hospital, the girl still lay tucked in a fetal position on her side in the bed. Her white room smelled of disinfectant over recently cleaned vomit. Her swollen head was bandaged whitely, so only the small delta of her bruised face showed. To Father Conrad, the bandages looked like a wimple, and she looked like a beaten nun. He heard Faust roar against Mephistopheles. The misery of this single one pierces the marrow of my life, and you are calmly grinning at the fate of 1,000s. She moaned, but her eyes remained swollen shut. The nurse, who was seated on the other side of the bed, stood and lifted her wrist to feel her pulse. Conrad watched her face register the information as the nurse looked at a watch attached to the belt of her uniform. It's well up beyond 60, she said, nodding. I must get the doctor. He could tell by her tone that this was good news. He leaned toward the bed after the nurse had left the private room, and he called the girl's name. Small slits appeared in her face. She strained to open her eyes. I am a priest, he said. Am I dying? She whispered. We are all, he thought. Living is dying. But by the time he shook off his self-absorption, she was again unconscious. Often now he so thoroughly disliked himself. Better naturalist and astronomer than priest, he thought. The door opened and he expected to see the nurse return with the doctor. Instead, in the doorway stood a dark figure in a black uniform marked with red and metal. He thought of the black blister beetle, with its yellow and red markings, distant cousin to the more familiar firefly. The soldier introduced himself as Corporal Dorner, one of Chancellor Hitler's personal guards. The effect was something out of a silent movie comedy, because the head snapping and the heel clicking were soundless. The priest knew that fatigue of his 2-day vigil was making him giddy, but there was something about these Nazis that made him feel like laughing. It reminded him of the feeling he had as a child when guilty friends were punished by their parents in his presence. He stifled the anxious laughter in his throat. Horst walked close to the bed, looking down at the girl and whispered a curse. Then more audibly he added, This is the work of communists and their Jew money. I believe it was a gang of Brownshirts who attacked the girl, the priest said. It is not a revolution of bourgeois shopkeepers the stormtroopers are about. Conrad nodded. Nevertheless, he smiled. Horst did not know if the priest was mocking him or not. He turned from him and stared down at the girl, who was curled up with her back to him. The important point is she is better, Conrad said. The nurse only just left. Yes, the Nazi looked hopeful. It was the first time Conrad could see anything recognizable in the young man's face. The door opened again. This time the nurse did enter with an elderly doctor. Horst took several steps back to allow the doctor to examine the patient. When the doctor touched her wrist, she groaned. The doctor nodded to the nurse, who smiled. Conrad saw the slits of Liesel's eyes open again. "What is it? What is it?" she began crying, first in a whisper, then the strengthening in her voice that rose to a scream. "No!" She pushed the doctor's hand and pushed with both her hands against the empty air. The exertion pained and exhausted her, and she fell back from the strain, whimpering. The nurse leaned over her to calm her and smooth the sheets and blanket, but her closeness seemed only to distress Lisel even more. "Gloves! In back! Of drawer!" she cried. She opened her eyes, trying to focus them. The doctor ordered a sedative. He had to repeat the order to the nurse, who was looking at Lisel oddly. Then the nurse seemed to shake herself and promptly left the room. The doctor looked about, at the priest, then at the soldier, then the bureau Conrad stood near. On the bureau was a vase of many-colored gladioli, a box of chocolates, and a blue dish of grapes. In the bottom drawer, the doctor found a forgotten pair of gloves, left behind by a patient who had died in his care 6 months earlier. "Interesting case," the doctor said. "Herr Doctor," Horst began. "Time." The doctor interrupted with a familiar answer. "It will surely take time and bed rest." He attempted to lean over Lisel again, now that she was breathing regularly. He touched her swollen eyelid with a delicacy Conrad admired, and began to shine a pencil light into her eyes. It was as if a trapped bird hid in the cave of her mind. She screamed again, this time at the doctor. "October, she'll be dead!" The medical man drew back, glanced quickly around, and pocketed the pencil light. Avoiding Conrad's curious gaze, he spoke to her. "Calm yourself now, young lady. There is nothing to fear." There was a tremor in his voice, which he had tried to force down into its lowest, most professional register. The nurse returned, but the doctor waved away the syringe she offered him on a tray. Instead, he demanded the patient's chart, and receiving it, wrote for several moments. Then, without another word, he left the room. The nurse looked down at the chart. "What is it?" Horst said. The nurse hesitated and looked at Conrad, who only tilted his head. Horst took a step towards the nurse, and she, along with Conrad, did not doubt the young officer would take the chart from her hands. Instead of relinquishing her medical authority, however, she gathered herself together and looked down at the chart, as if for the first time. "Psychiatric," she announced. She nodded as if agreeing with the doctor's determination. Then she too left the room. Horst and Conrad faced one another across the white bed. It felt to the priest that he could not leave the girl alone with this Nazi, although he felt distinctly that this was what was wanted. Then, surprisingly, the young officer knelt in the position of prayer, and this action so moved Conrad that he felt like placing a hand on the penitent's short blonde hair to bless him. Horst held still for some time, then rested his head against Liesel's back that held strictly to the edge of the bed. At his touch, she moaned again, deeply. "Sweetheart," he echoed her moan. The priest was drawn toward Lisel, and leaned toward her struggling face. He bent down so that his head was beside her lips to hear what she was whispering. To Horst, on the other side of the bed, it was no more than choking breathing. He was at the ready to spring and run for the doctor. "Hummingbird," she whispered again and again. Colibri, a word automatically translated in Conrad's mind. Colibri! He was about to stroke the suffering girl's shoulder when he grasped the effect touch had on her. He stood again. Horst stood with him, assuming his rigid self-control. "She needs to rest," the doctor said. Horst ordered himself, snapping his head down and up at his own command. Acknowledging the priest briefly, he turned on his heel and left the room. Conrad sat down on the chair by the window. He felt the warm sun through the glass like hands rubbing his tired shoulders. Automatically, he folded his hands and prayed inwardly, allowing himself the luxury of the thought that Albert would come once it was dark. And this night, he might be able to go to bed and sleep, though sleep for months had been a stranger to him. "Be with us now and in this hour of death, amen," he prayed in silence. "Be with us now and in this hour of death, amen." Her whispers echoed his thoughts exactly. Some hours later, she opened her eyes and tried to focus in the dark. She could tell, she did not know how, that the nurse and the priest were not in the room with her, but she was not alone. It was another night, and the night presence was with her. She heard hospital sounds outside her door. She heard metal and wheels and quickly moving feet. She felt in her body for pain, but it was hiding at a particular place now. It was no longer everywhere. Her head hurt worse, but still was not as bad as before. It did not pound with her pulse, and the terrible nausea was gone. Where she was raw and hot and sore, she did not like to think about. Her eyes focused in the dark from the streetlight coming into the window. Her hand fluttered to her head in confusion. Searching, she felt the stiff edges of the bandages. A man was standing by the window looking up at the night sky. "Father," she said. The figure turned. No, it is Herr Entrater. How are you feeling?" "Herr Entrater?" "Yes. Do you want anything?" Albert asked, uncomfortably. "Where is my hair?" she cried. They cut off my hair." "Shh," he soothed. I want to go home, please." "All right now. You must try to go back to sleep, Liezel. You must rest yourself." Herr Entrater had a foolish high voice, but sweet. He began to tell her a story as if she were a little girl. "Once, many years ago, 7 sisters went walking, and one became lost in the forest. One of the 7 brothers in the Big Dipper found her, and her beauty was such that he fell in love with her at once." As she listened to the story, she stopped crying, then slowly untucked her legs and stretched them out under the sheet and blankets. It was cool against her calves and bare feet. She let herself sink into the softening mattress, into the echo of the sound of his voice. What does this future hold for our heroine? Summer of the Long Knives is available for purchase on Amazon. Tune in next week when we discuss writing alternative history with indie author LS Bassen. Please take a moment to rate and review our podcast on your platform of choice. Each review is a wonderful way to support this show. I am your host, Benjamin Franke, asking everyone to read more books, be the best possible you, and to simply enjoy this wonderful life. Thanks for listening.